Good morning, everyone. From Nairobi, it's such a sunny day out there, and thank God it's Friday. I mean, it's been a long week. So, welcome to the Yale Bridges webinar today on the 5th of June, 2020. My name is Stephen Okot, and I am the founder and lead at Cyber in Africa, the voice of Africa's cybersecurity. We are a cybersecurity media startup with a mission to bring, or rather, take Africa's cybersecurity to the forefront of the continent and the global scenes. So we do this through media, we do special industry program events, we offer marketing, brand development, thought leadership, a bit of research. We create content and deliver them, do media coverage and productions, and all of this for the cybersecurity actors across Africa. And we're very lucky to be a part of the Yale Bridges webinar and to be hosting the session today. In this webinar, we are going to consider and discuss corporate governance in the age of cybersecurity risks, focusing on what makes corporate governance, the intersection of corporate governance with cybersecurity, and how leadership is involved, and even more. So today we have a panel of three gentlemen, no ladies, unfortunately, who will be addressing the above issues and others that will spring up during the conversation. So they will be introducing themselves in a bit. In the meantime, you can connect with them on the links I am going to share in a minute. So please connect with them, connect with us. I would love to talk to you. Join our networks on LinkedIn, follow us on Twitter, follow us in other places as well. Check out the Yale Bridges website and the other website in the links. All right, so now a bit of housekeeping today. Please ask your questions or seek clarifications in the chat section. Feel free again to share information or any links to any knowledge resources within the chat. In case there's a technical hitch on our end during the course of this webinar, please stick around and be patient for us as we hustle to sort them throughout, because these things happen all the time. So before we get into today's agenda, in our webinar last week, we talked about cyber insurance as a risk treatment method, and I know some of you attended the webinar. We talked about third-party risks, and then also how to ensure third-party risks, to ensure assurance for third-party risks. As well, we talked about the mechanics of getting insured for cybersecurity. For those who missed, the session is on record, and you can check it up on the Yale Bridges YouTube website. Lisa will be kind enough as to share the link to the YouTube page here so that you can look at the video as well. We had a raffle, and our winner for the free virtual microsecurity awareness training and cyber insurance advisory is Richard Otolo. So Richie, if you're in here, please, Yale Bridges will be reaching out to you, either Steve or Lisa, just to follow up to ensure that you get the raffle prize. So we might do another raffle today. So if you're in the room, please stick around for that, and I'll be sharing more information regarding that later on. Okay, so on to a quick poll. We love doing polls here just to get us started. So our poll today, we have two questions, and we'd like you to quickly, within the next minute or so, respond to the polls on your screen. Question number one is, have you ever trained your board or senior management on cybersecurity? And the next one is, how often do you train your board and senior management on cybersecurity? So we'd like your responses in the next minute or so. I can see they're coming in thick and fast. Okay. Interesting. Keep going. We're doing over 30% now. We're just hitting 50. Have you ever trained your board or your senior management on cybersecurity? Keep going, guys. You're doing more than 50. We're doing at slightly over 50% now. When you hit 80%, I'm gonna shut down the poll. So let's keep going. Okay, interesting. Okay, more people. If you've not polled, please be kind enough as to give us your response. Please respond to both questions. They sort of go as a package. Okay, we are doing almost 70%. Okay, just a few more guys. If you've not polled yet, please give us your feedback. For those just joining us, please go ahead and give us your feedback on the poll. Have you ever trained your board or senior management on cybersecurity, and how often do you train your board and the senior management on cybersecurity? Interesting. We're almost getting to 80, so keep going, guys. All right, we are closing down in a few seconds. If you've not polled, please give us your feedback. Okay, we are closing in a few seconds. A couple guys, I still see a couple guys not yet polled. I would like to get your feedback. Okay, and that brings us to the end. So thanks everyone for giving us feedback. I will be sharing the results of this poll within the course of the conversation. But again, this is a good segue into what you're going to talk about. And we'll be talking about corporate governance, focusing much on board and the senior level management, and talk about how these two groups of people manage cybersecurity governance. So sweet. So let's get into today's conversation. And gentlemen, I'd like you to introduce yourself, and I'll start with our host, Steve, then go to Nelson, then go to this. Steve?
Good morning, everyone. Welcome into this webinar. As it's been said, my name is Steve Mambo, the Chief Operating Officer of Yale Bridges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Nelson Nyoro. My name is Nelson Nyoro. I'm a business management consultant and also working with the government as a director of cooperatives in Mombasa County. And I'm a friend of Yale Bridges. Happy to be here.
Yeah, you're welcome, Nelson. Dismas, in the room?
Yes, good morning. My name is Dismas Ongondi. I am a cybersecurity professional, currently serving as the Chief Operating Officer at Sinaloc Cybersecurity in Nairobi. I have industry experience spanning across both private and public sector, oil and gas, banking, and many other, as well as elections. Happy to be part of this discussion today. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, Disman, and we're looking to tap in a lot into your experience.
Thank you very much.
So I'd like to start us off. Absolutely. To start us off, I'd like to invite Nelson to give us a brief presentation of what he had prepared for this conversation. Again, as a great way to start the talk today, and he will help us understand straight up two things. Number one, what really is corporate governance? Because many a times we assume, we who are in the space assume that others actually understand these things. So he'll break that down for us and then give us an understanding of what really makes corporate governance. So Nelson, if you'll be kind, please go ahead and share your screen.
I'm not very sure that I'll be able to share the screen, but maybe Lisa, because she's a co-host, she can share with us. But I can go straight into my discussion as the screen is being shared. Yeah, so thank you very much. Allow me to indicate that we have two discussions here. One is corporate governance in general. Then we have ICT governance. And I will spend a little bit of time just to look at corporate governance and then link it with ICT corporate governance. Now, ICT corporate governance is going to be a discussion with us for some time, given a number of factors. One is the significance of ICT in business processes as a value driver. Then two is the ability to create business disruptions. It is a major source of disruption in our businesses, that is ICT. The aspect of ICT, what we call technology mudslide. And then, of course, the heavy investment involved in ICT. And many people keep on asking whether ICT has become a cost center, because many organizations have not been able to realize the true value from their investment. And that brings to us the issues that touches on corporate governance for ICT. So maybe looking at the definition of corporate governance, the general aspect, I'll look at the general definition. Then I'll look at how corporate governance is interlinked with ICT. And corporate governance can be defined as the processes, and I'm going to decompose this definition so that I can pick various aspects about corporate governance. So it is about the processes, the policies, the procedures, the structures, and the actions employed by a board to oversee and monitor an organization so that it can achieve its objective. So allow me to go back to that definition and decompose it and look at corporate governance as an aspect of processes. And because we are talking about ICT cybersecurity, underscore that security risk event can be derived from the business process models. If you are to analyze the business processes, you could see areas that portend risk for a business. And so corporate governance as an aspect of process identification has a number of aspects that you look at. You look at the processes and the process. You look at the processes and the risk requirement, the vulnerability aspect. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. The vulnerability aspect of each and every process. And then, of course, the threat processes chain. You are decomposing each and every step that an organization undertakes to deliver value or to deliver a service to its customers and highlight who are the actors involved, and then you map them. So that is an aspect of corporate governance. Then those processes need to have a policy guideline indicating exactly what is the level of responsibility. The processes tend to create structures. And so we are talking about the structures now. We are looking at the organization design. We are looking at the aspect of how is the organization designed to deliver value. There you're talking about the levels, the organogram, creating responsibilities, creating the reporting lines. All those are aspects. I'm still within the definition of corporate governance. So if you can go back to that slide, Risa. So these are the aspects of, yes, that is where we are. So these are the aspects of corporate governance that are key. Now, when you look at the structures, you start now going to the pillars of corporate governance. One pillar being internal control. So we can go to the next slide, which is about the pillars of corporate governance. Let's talk about internal controls as a pillar of corporate governance, and then we'll be looping in ICT governance as part of it. In the internal controls, you are looking at the prevention of potential problems. And now because we're talking about cyber risk, then so we're talking about prevention of potential risk. That brings us to an aspect of intrusion prevention. If it is an ICT expert now who is talking, from a business management perspective, I'm looking at what do you do to prevent potential problems. So for you to prevent them, you need to identify them. Then the other part of internal controls, early detection and corrections of actual problems or risk. And so here we are talking about intrusion detection. Now, that is one pillar of corporate governance. And so, as a business management consultant, I'll be asking a key question. How is ICT aligned to help in the internal controls? Because that is a source of intrusion, and it is also an area where you do want to detect. And I know if this discussion was to continue, we could say very many things about the detection, area detection, the importance of area detection, preempting a risk. Another aspect of corporate governance is the Ringel Framework. And that brings us to the aspect of compliance, the regulatory requirement. And so again, we ask, how is ICT aligned to the aspect of compliance requirement, the Ringel Framework within which the business is operating? I can look at all these things. Allow me to talk about the organization culture as another pillar of corporate governance. How is organization, the ideology, the philosophy of the organization? A key aspect of it would be what is the tone set by the board, the senior managers, and that is the one that reverberates within the entire organization as far as certain business behaviors and practices are concerned. You go to an organization and you find an organization risk conscious. That could be defined to be part of an organization culture. An organization culture would be the beliefs, the practices, the norms, the way people go on in their day-to-day businesses. And this is the tone that is defined at the top. And so in the ICT corporate governance, you start to appreciate the role of the senior managers, you start to appreciate the role of board of directors in terms of creating the right organization culture, the right environment for ICT security. And there are many things. We talk about authority, which is an aspect of internal controls, but there you're not starting to talk about authorization, you're starting to talk about access, you're starting to talk about segregation. How much power is given to each and every person? Now that is corporate governance in the general form. So allow me now to look at ICT governance. And so I have very simple definitions of ICT governance. One is the distribution of ICT decision-making rights and responsibilities among different stakeholders. And the other one is the rules and procedures for making and monitoring decisions on strategic ICT concerns. So if you could take me to the slide on ICT value drivers, we can create a very brief discussion there. The second slide. The following slide, the slide that is following this. Yes, there. So let's decompose now ICT corporate governance and looking at it from the value drivers. What are the key issues that you think about if you're talking about ICT corporate governance? One is strategic alignment. To what extent is ICT aligned to where the business is going? Is ICT serving the business needs, both present and the future needs of the business? Is ICT properly aligned to the business processes? Is the ICT properly aligned to the internal controls? Is ICT properly aligned to the organization culture? And all those aspects we talk about ICT, corporate governance pillars. Is ICT properly aligned? Another aspect of ICT governance is value delivery. In terms of the cost, in terms of the scope, in terms of quality, in terms of time. If we were to look at the business processes and like of business risk, then we look at ICT resource management, and here you analyze the ICT both as the investment and the people involved in ICT. And so when you're looking at the ICT resource management, you are analyzing the investment that you have made there and also the people you have put there. And I like the 4 question that was asking, how often do you train the people involved in ICT? Because the more you increase their consciousness, especially as far as risk is concerned, the more you improve their response. So that is the whole aspect of ICT resource management. And it is an area for measurement. Another aspect is risk management, where you're looking at the IT audit and how often do you assess the risk? Do you conduct system audits? All these are aspects of assessing the risk. Do you identify areas of vulnerability? This is an aspect of ICT corporate governance. To what extent is your ICT compliant and all those other things? And then, of course, lastly is the performance management. And using the tool of the balance scorecard, you look at to what extent does the ICT satisfy our need for customer focus? Does it help us serve our customers better? To what extent does our ICT improves in terms of operational efficiency? If you're a service industry, you've been an industry, you possibly be looking at the cycle time, you'll be looking at the accident controls. All those are issues to do with operational efficiency. To what extent does it become a source of our knowledge base? And we talk about the capital, the knowledge capital, as an ICT contribution aspect, the value proposition for ICT in learning and growth. And then lastly is to what extent does ICT contribute to our financial pillar? Does it help us increase, multiply our sources of income, help us diversify sources of income, help us create alternative income? That is subjecting the ICT to the balance scorecard as far as performance management is concerned. And therefore, to conclude the discussion is looking at the conceptual framework for ICT governance, which is the last slide. You can go to the last slide. And so what are the predictors of ICT governance? And there are 3, in my view, and there could be many, but one is ICT performance management, and we have talked about all that, good project management from the initiation. How do you identify that this is what you need? How do you do implementation? And then, of course, the performance management, which I have talked about, the use of the balance scorecard to determine whether the investment that you created in the ICT has brought value. Many organizations have been accused of investing so much, generating very little. You could go back to the good project management. And a key component of good project management as far as ICT governance is concerned is involving the right people in making the decisions. About to what extent is ICT to the values, to the culture of the organization, to what extent is it aligned and communication between ICT and strategy, to what extent are the top and middle management supporting and owning the ICT strategies, and then of course the stakeholders involvement. And then lastly is the ICT resource management. How much are you willing to put into this? And then 2 is the skills that are requisite and the people that you have involved. These are the drivers of what we are now looking at as the ICT governance, which informs the structure, the processes, the relationship, and the ICT infrastructure. So in a nutshell, that is how I would marry ICT governance with the general corporate governance of any enterprise. Thank you. I am done.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so great introduction there, and you've really literally taken us through a journey of understanding the governance aspect from a general standpoint, and you brought in the ICT aspect. So I'd like probably to bring take it further into the cybersecurity specific governance. And if I can mention a few things from what you've shared, you've talked about processes and policies and risks. You've talked about roles and responsibilities as with regards to the different business units within an organization. You've talked about the culture, which is big when it comes to cybersecurity. You've talked as well about the investment aspect or the strategic aspect of ICT. Again, cybersecurity is, I believe, a cost. But the question is, how do you demonstrate the value? You see, from a strategic investment perspective. So, if I can just mention one thing and then come to you, Dismas, is the way I say that corporate governance it definitely refers to a lot about the roles and the responsibilities, and especially when it comes to the senior level management and the board, and even to investors, for example. So I'd like to know from you, Dismas, as a security practitioner, very experienced, worked in GRC, I believe, a lot. So what really is, why is cybersecurity really considered a corporate governance issue? You know, within the ICT framework and even outside, why is it considered a serious corporate governance issue?
Thank you very much. I think in the intro, when we looked at the whole discipline of corporate governance as the mechanisms established to direct, control, and guide the management of corporate entities, one of the elements that emerged is the element of risk management or enterprise risk management. In terms of delivering value by organizations to their stakeholders, they have to be able to manage risk. And cybersecurity management is part of enterprise risk management. Therefore, in terms of the relationship between corporate governance and cybersecurity governance, we're talking about the application of those same set of principles in corporate governance to the specific domain of cybersecurity to direct, to control, to manage and regulate the performance of cybersecurity within an organization. It has two elements, internal and external, in terms of an organization's cybersecurity relationship to the regulators, which brings in the element of compliance. And we take the specific example, we're talking about data protection and privacy. We now have the Data Protection Act. Whatever it is that organizations do in terms of collecting and processing data using their technologies must comply with the principles of data protection. For example, in terms of purpose limitation, in terms of legitimacy, how much information should an organization collect from their customers to be able to serve them? And the amount of information that must be collected must just be enough, no more, no less, to meet that specific objective. Therefore, simply put, cybersecurity governance as part of the ICT domain is basically concerned as part of the enterprise risk management, which applies those very same principles to ensure that the usage of ICT facilities within organizations by both the internal and the external stakeholders is done in an accountable and responsible manner. So that if, for example, it's a question of audit, which is a mandate of the board, or meeting certain regulatory requirements, then using those same technologies that are deployed within organizations, an enterprise must be able to demonstrate that their systems are still able to be auditable and that they meet the external mandates of the applicable laws and regulations that pertain to that specific sector. In terms of internal procedures, we're talking about best practices. If an entity is operating within the specific sector, how does it compare? Apart from just addressing the external dictates, the laws and regulations, like this to gain competitive edge over the competition. And that is, I think, for now, what I would say. But again, maybe just before I conclude my presentation at this point in time. So when we talk about the specific process of risk management, which is cybersecurity is about, we're talking about applying specific frameworks. And if you look at the risk management, the generic risk management frameworks like the COSO, the cybersecurity risk management frameworks like the NIST cybersecurity risk management framework borrows heavily from the generic principles of risk management, which is to identify your risks through a process of risk assessment, protecting those assets that you have identified by identifying potential threats and the source of threats and who the potential threat actors are likely to be, detecting when those threats actually happen, responding and recovering. And that brings in the element of also continuity and disaster recovery planning as elements of cybersecurity management within enterprise organizations or bodies.
Interesting. So cyber risk governance is essentially part of the enterprise-wide risk management effort. And at the same time, it's hugely a risk issue that the board is responsible for. And you've talked about the internal and the external aspects, which will come to a bit later on. So I'd like to know, now that you've mentioned the board and the responsibilities, and at the back probably stops with the board, the senior management and the board. So what are the responsibilities and the demands of the board, and board committees and senior level managements nowadays in terms of managing the cyber risk governance? What would you say, Dismas?
Well, the starting point again is just looking at the generic responsibilities of boards in corporate governance. And the starting point is basically setting the tone at the top by establishing policy which gives general direction and intents of what the board intends to achieve with a cybersecurity governance framework. So they set the policy and have it approved, which then guides senior management to implement a specific framework that is contained within that policy. And then the board provides oversight over management's execution of or implementation of that policy. And now, the other thing, of course, the other thing that the board would be responsible in terms of the cybersecurity governance would be funding the program, because if they do not allocate sufficient resources, then the objectives of that program will not be met. And if they are, then will not be met in a timely manner. And we are talking about doing things beyond just the requirement of passing an audit. We are saying we want to adopt this as a best practice, and therefore we want to, you're looking at boards increasingly desiring to implement cybersecurity governance in a way that demonstrates value to the stakeholders and specifically the shareholders, so that rather than seeing the cost, they actually see the value that this delivers to the organization. So besides funding the program, approving policy, it is also the responsibility of boards to ensure that roles and responsibilities are appropriately assigned within the organization for the purpose of carrying out the specific tasks that are related to cybersecurity governance. And of course, as we said also, the board has a responsibility in terms of its relationships with key external stakeholders who may be shareholders, as well as regulators. And therefore, there might be some specific requirements in terms of how the board responds to the regulators on issues that arise, for example, from data protection. If you look at what is currently happening globally, we have an increasing number of remote workforce, which is likely to constrain existing resources, and some of the networks that we are actually relying on may not have been provisioned adequately to handle such kind of volume. The second thing is many organizations probably did not have the time to carry out a proper and comprehensive risk assessment to identify the potential risks associated with the deployment of these new technologies that they have been forced to adopt for the purpose of survival. In addition to that, you're looking at when you have a huge remote workforce, and especially in organizations that traditionally didn't do this, you're talking about how much value is the use of these new technologies by having a lot of people working remotely. How much value are these enterprise organizations or corporate entities delivering to their customers? How much longer can they continue operating this way without collapsing, without compromising the quality and the value of the services that they're actually delivering to their key customers, or even meeting compliance and regulatory requirements?
Interesting. Nelson, do you have anything?
Stephas, could I just jump in on one simple one idea that I've also picked from Dismas? One other thing that we also need to remember is how did this responsibility also get to the board level? Long gone were the days that cybersecurity or IT security was the responsibility of the CIO. Now, when you look at the cost of these cyber incidents, that is also another factor that drove the conversation to the board, because organizations started realizing that the cost from cyber incident was massive and leading to financial losses to the organization. And hence the board, who have a fiduciary responsibility to protect the stakeholders and shareholders' interests. That also drove the interest and the need for the board also to start taking cybersecurity as part of boardroom discussions. In addition to that, in addition to the regulations that are also being passed, even by local regulators, for example, the CBK, there are specific responsibilities that have also been given to the board in terms of managing cybersecurity. And this comes in the sense that the regulator understands that cyber risks today can actually impact the economy, not just a single individual organization. So as a regulator, in a way to protect the industry, to protect the economy, they also push that responsibility back to the individuals who have fiduciary responsibility, which is the board. And in terms of also of budgeting, I think Dismas has also mentioned this quite in details. The tone is set from the top. We say that culture is not is what you do, not necessarily what you say. So if that culture is not set right at the top, going downwards to the rest of the organizational structure, nothing much will be able to be achieved in terms of cyber risk management. Thank you.
And probably I could add to what Steve has said in terms of how these responsibilities get down to the board. In regulated and highly regulated industries like the telecom industry, the financial services industry, you are required by law and regulations for your sector to comply and do specific things for cybersecurity. For example, under the prudential guidelines issued by the central bank for entities or banks that are regulated by the Central Bank of Kenya, there are specific requirements in terms of, for example, business continuity as part of the enterprise risk management or information segment as part of the enterprise risk management. They must have somebody responsible at individual level, which is within management's case, appointment of respective or relevant committees to take care of these issues. Now, under the, even for those enterprise corporate entities that are not highly regulated, the new Data Protection Act, which has now taken effect, requires, depending on the size of the organization, that you actually appoint somebody responsible for the implementation of the data protection program within your organization and demonstrate compliance to the regulator, the Data Protection Commissioner, how your organization is addressing some of these issues. If one of your customers raises issues about the amount of information you have collected from them, or if they demand that you are asking, they need to know what information you are holding and who you are sharing it with them, you as a corporate entity have a responsibility to respond to that subject request without an option. And there are specific timelines. In Kenya, if an individual asks to the information, you have, like, say, 72 hours within which you must respond. I think it's 30 days within which you must respond. If you look at the GDPR in the EU, they're actually giving you 30 days, almost 72 hours to respond. And the failure to comply with some of these requirements can lead to very hefty fines. In the GDPR in Kenya, you're talking about fines for data breach of up to 5 million shillings. In the EU GDPR, you're talking about 2% of the worldwide revenue of the organization that is affected. And that is not a small amount of money. You're talking about hundreds of millions for data breaches. So essentially, for regulated industries, you're saying, or sectors, you're saying you don't have a choice. By law and regulation, you are required to comply, and there are specific provisions that require you to do that. For those that may not be heavily regulated, you want to demonstrate, or you at least have the Data Protection Act applicable to you, and you want to do this to demonstrate so that you can have a competitive edge as a best practice that gives you a competitive edge over the competition.
So, Dismas, you had initially mentioned that the board has a role of making the external stakeholders, or rather other stakeholders, investors, and others, to be able to see value and not cost, if I can quote you, when it comes to cybersecurity investment. Again, you and Steve have specifically talked about the demands on the board by regulators and other external actors to be able to be keen on cybersecurity. Now, I know they have to be keen because for some of the roles you had mentioned, they have to oversight and allocate funding and resources, etc. But then my question is, how can we, in a very practical sense, make boards become more cyber risk focused? How do we ensure that they actually focus on cyber risk? Because if you go to the board and you tell them, you give them your story, and then tell them, I want money, I need to hire these people, I need to introduce this and that, I need to buy this, you know, they will definitely ask you questions. And if it's a board that is not enabled enough to focus on cybersecurity as a real risk issue, then that would be a problem. So how do we practically get boards to become cyber risk focused? Dismas, Steve, Nelson, you can jump in as well.
Yes,
Steve, you want to have a first go at it?
Well, I think Steve is out. Nelson?
Yeah, I can make a mention.
Sorry.
And then I drop back to Dismas, and I want to appreciate the discussion he has created in terms of the role of the board. And maybe just allow me to make a mention and then marry with this. People manage at their level. And so the more you increase awareness about the risk involved in their enterprise and how that risk can translate to a personal responsibility. If I look at various organizations that have suffered loss of money through ICT, I see the same relationship with the reputation of the people who are managing at that particular time. And so if we could increase the awareness, the consciousness that if you do not take care of the risk, it has a personal bearing to your responsibility and your reputation in future, then people would give it more attention. Then of course, two, I wanted to talk about the organization culture as an aspect of ICT governance and look at the shape of organization culture as an iceberg. We see the tip. If you want to look at how conscious an organization is as far as ICT risk is, you only see the tip. But underlying are the issues of the culture. That tells you the issues that the board has placed importance. Let me pick a few examples. One is where ICT is placed in the organization structure. You see some organization that ICT is a very remote department, an extension, possibly even reporting to some very junior people. That is an indication of how much they have appreciated the role of ICT in risk management. And so if the more you increase the consciousness, the more you see ICT, the whole department, given more prominence in the organization. And that is why you even go to some organization and you see that the ICT has been properly structured, equipped, and there is continuous training. Even look at the budget distribution in terms of how much is allocated for training on this cyber risk. You understand what it means to have understood the significance of it. So for me, keep on training the board, increase their consciousness and their awareness about the risk.
And in addition,
just to add on to what Nelson has just mentioned, awareness is critical, and awareness is not just advising the board members, what they need to do to protect their emails, what they need to do to avoid phishing emails. It goes beyond that awareness. The awareness here is in the sense of understanding what a successful cyber attack would mean to the business, not just the financial loss, the reputation loss to that business, whether that incident will also affect how the organization engages with other partners. And more coming back now to the internal team, or more so the IT team, how does also the IT team communicate to the board? What language are they using to communicate to the board? Because the board, most of the times, may not even be having that technical expertise, not even to talk about cybersecurity. So it comes back to how does the ICT team, what language do they use to communicate that risk to the board? Not technical language, but it's an issue of being able to tie the cyber risk vis-a-vis a dollar or a Kenya shillings perspective. So basically you are tying the risk and attaching it to a financial figure. So that it starts making sense to the board members for them to know, given the risk that we have, or rather, this is the value at risk if this business is exposed, and if we also fail to put in these measures, and if we put in these cyber defense controls, this is how we reduce that risk, which also goes back to reduce the risk, the financial exposure of the business. So that's something also that is very critical for the board also to appreciate. How have we quantified our cyber risks?
Dismas? Oh, Dismas, if you can hear me. I think we've lost. Can you hear me?
You can hear me now?
Yes, please.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, Dismas.
Yes. How do you get boards to support cybersecurity governance within the organization? This is the same question you would ask. How would you get boards to support and push corporate governance within the organization? There are a couple of things that one would love to look at, in addition to what Nelson and Steve have said. Culture is one. Of course, communication in terms of in a language that boards understand. But I think for me, the starting point is the process of selecting boards. How are board members, how are directors engaged? How are they identified and selected to join specific boards? What expertise, specific expertise, do they have an interest in their board? Do you have provision, for example, from independent directors who are an independent voice that can speak for their shareholders at board meetings? How are these specific boards balanced in terms of expertise? So you don't want to have to offload a board with a specific, regardless of the industry they are in, with people from a specific profession, because then that is not a balanced board. So you're looking at how boards are selected, the composition of those boards, and how they are balanced, and you have actually somebody at board level who is driving cybersecurity governance, who understands the need for this. Now, again, when I talk about regulated industries, financial services, education sector, telcos, there are specific mandates. There are certain things that boards of organizations are required to do to address specific cybersecurity requirements that have been externally mandated by the regulators. Now, a failure to, it is either the options for boards in such a scenario is either they comply or they explain. And the moment you tell a board that the law requires you to comply with this or explain, obviously, that is probably one of the easiest ways of getting boards which to start actually supporting the process. And again, as I said, even for industries that are not regulated, and in fact, we are having we are hardly seeing any industries that are not going to be regulated in the future. With this is the increasing connectedness in the world, and with the emergence of data protection, everybody is going to be required to comply with certain specific requirements in cybersecurity as part of the enterprise risk management. So they would have no choice. So this is something that you need to do at organizations need to look at in terms of selecting their boards, and also once those boards are selected, how they form committees and how they assign roles and responsibilities and how they fund this program to ensure that the objectives of cybersecurity governance are actually met within the organizations, to avoid a scenario where they are called upon to explain for not complying with requirements.
Interesting. I mean, you've taken such a nice angle that personally probably have never thought about this before. You know, a selection of boards. You know, who are we bringing in? You know, what is probably the experience, and how could they contribute, particularly, especially to the cybersecurity conversation. And then I think the awareness is very, very important. Not just about the how-tos or the mechanics of keeping safe and secure at the board level, but most importantly, the risk aspect of it. You know, and culture again is something that all of you have spoken to, and I'll want to throw this out. And I'm particularly focused on the house. How do we get things done in a very practical way? So leaders must set the pace or the tone for the organization when it comes to overall corporate governance and particularly IT and security. So how do we get these high-level guys, decision makers, to actually do the actual tone setting? And forgive me if you might have already answered this question, but I just need clarity, like, on how can the board get to the ground and start setting the tone for the organization. And I think here I'll start with Nelson.
Very well. So I like the way you are emphatic on the issue of culture and, of course, the how. How does the board now get going as far as increasing ICT risk management in the organization? One of the things that the board need to do is develop the right policy. Have a policy in place, do proper identification, and in that whole process, creating responsibility at each and every level, starting, of course, with the board itself to create a structure, whether it is a board committee or otherwise, like Dismas has said. Even the board doing an audit of itself, if they discover they do not have the requisite skills, depending with the regulations within which they operate, they can either co-opt, they can bring a dependent board who have those skills. So the board must do an inventory of skills and equip itself properly. Like I said, people manage at their level. So for that which you don't understand, you can't manage. So an inventory of skill at the board and create the right structure, have somebody or a committee responsible. Board works through committees. So create a committee in charge of ICT risk management. That would be the committee, develop reporting lines, reporting period of reporting. And then at the management level, have people who again report to that committee to be reporting ultimately to the entire board. So it is about create the right structure, develop the policy. Then, of course, assess investment need for ICT risk investment. Have a thorough audit of your systems, do an audit, identify areas of vulnerabilities, identify what you need to invest in, and commit money. And then 3 is continuous training of the people on emerging risk, keep on identifying, commit to researching, getting new knowledge, because risk is not a static thing. It keeps on mutating every day. So invest as much as you can and remain ahead of the risk level. Thank you.
Dismas again here. In addition to all that, one of the other things I would imagine, if you are a serious corporate entity that is committed to delivering high value to your shareholders and being the best in your class, one of the things you want to do is to identify who are your corporate role models. And that can be within the same market segment, whether it is outside your own geography or within your own geography, so that you can actually demonstrate to the board how your corporate role model is performing and delivering value to their key customers compared to how much you are doing. If you look at the present scenario, education sector today, everybody adopted technologies like the one we're using today to deliver some education, some form of education. But basically, they were forced by circumstances. Many of these educational institutions, I'm talking about colleges, schools, and universities, probably prior to the emergence of the COVID-19, were not already providing remote learning or distant, and even our own views, our own opinions about and perceptions about distant learning is something that is bound to change, because in the past we used to think that it is not the go-to method of earning a good quality education. But here, circumstances are now forcing people to keep social distances, minimize physical contact, and therefore, even for schools that were traditionally well established in terms of delivering some form of remote learning, are now almost exclusively providing remote learning to their students. The question is, for how much longer can this continue? And how much of that is actually effective? Some courses, by their very nature, for example, like in the engineering disciplines, are practical. And the question is then, how effectively can a school deliver a practical program remotely without having lab sessions? I know you can talk about setting virtual lab sessions, but the question is, are those lab sessions as effective as physical lab sessions where you have students interacting, comparing notes? But again, I'm not necessarily saying there's a problem. So basically what I'm saying is, in terms of a corporate entity trying to get into this to drive this process, you need to identify yourself. If you are a university, who are your benchmark setters? Identify a corporate role model that you want to be like and try to work towards achieving their level of performance that they are able to achieve. The second thing that you would look at is in terms of making sure that cybersecurity governance or even corporate governance is part of an organizational culture, and especially in performance-based organizations, is to link specific performance objectives to individuals' roles and responsibilities, so that when you are doing your performance evaluation, you are also assessing the performance to the extent to which these specific individuals in the organization have addressed the corporate governance or the cybersecurity governance responsibilities in their performance or the execution of their duties and within the organization. Now, to do that, therefore, it means you are setting up performance-related objectives. Alongside that, you have a compliance objective, which is related to audit and regulation, and you also have a cybersecurity-related objective, which is basically talking about data protection and making sure that the systems are available and the integrity of the information that you provide to your customers, your other stakeholders like regulators, is accurate and done so in a timely manner. The other element that you would want to bring in is the onboarding process for joiners to an organization. When you have new staff joining, you want to make cybersecurity governance as part of your induction training, so that right from the day somebody joins an organization, whether they have specific roles and responsibilities for cybersecurity, they are at least taken through the basics of cybersecurity in terms of how to protect information, starting with simple things like keeping a clean desk policy, making sure that you don't share your passwords. Now, and for people who are specifically employed as professionals within the cybersecurity domain, their training must be customized and delivered in a way that brings them to a level where they are able to support the organization meet her requirements for cybersecurity to the regulators and to the other stakeholders.
Just to add on to the same, it's also important to note when we discuss about culture, we also have to talk about commitment. And that commitment from the board level comes from the point where they are setting up the cyber resilience strategy. Now it's not just a matter of cybersecurity, we are now talking of cyber resilience, that despite an adverse threat, we are still able to do business. Now, once the strategy is up and ready, the board passes it on the strategy now to the senior management for implementation and of course set up the other structures that have been discussed earlier. But also of importance is, it's good to have a strategy, but assessing that strategy is very critical for the board, so that you're able to know which areas are we failing as an organization, which areas do we need improvement from a very high level, not just from a technical perspective. And that also guides in terms of the other elements that we've discussed. How are we able to allocate budget to this cybersecurity function within the business? Which other resources are required within this function? What other elements do we need also to consider, and who do we also need to benchmark for us to be able to attain that cybersecurity position that the business envisioned as per what had been put on the strategy? So it's the strategy and the commitment to that strategy that is also very critical as part of the culture.
Interesting stuff. Well, I mean, I'm trying to figure out what to say here because I'm learning a lot today. So there's been a mention about the corporate role modeling. Fantastic idea as well. I love it. I just had to talk about it. And and then of course people managing at their own level, it's probably top down. You don't manage what you don't know. There's a Deloitte report that stated that what you don't know can kill you. So in essence, that actually means that if you don't know your risks, if you don't know the threats to the organizations, if you don't understand what are your valuable assets and how to protect them, then probably someone is going to shut you down someday. Someone is going to ensure there's no continuity of business. Okay. And talking of continuity of business, let me bring this in quickly. This is again one of the topics that is talked about a lot. What are the cybersecurity fears for corporate leaders? Any of you can have a go on this. What are the fears that leaders, CEOs, management, board members are actually facing, and it's giving them sleepless nights, as we speak? Let me start with you, Steve.
Yes, I'm there. Sorry.
Oh, good. Okay.
I would say the thing that probably keeps board awake at night would be waking up in the morning and to read the news that your business has been, or rather your organization has been compromised, or your company data is exposed out there, and you have to deal with the consequences of that.
So we are talking about hack, like really getting hacked, in the real sense.
Yes.
All right, that falls for a good headline. Doesn't look for a good headline. Dismas?
Yeah, for me, I think you will have to look at this from sector-specific regulations or requirements or fears. If you look at, for example, in terms of if it is an educational institution, what would be some of the fears for top management at universities, colleges, and schools? First is now that we are in a lockdown, and that applies to a lot of countries in the world, are they still able to carry on with their educational programs in the way that they intended? Would they be able to finish this program on time? So there's the element of availability. And there's also the issue of perception. How will the parents and the learners perceive this method of delivery? But more important than that, that just addresses the availability element of the service to key customers in the education sector. We're putting a lot of information out there in the cloud. We're using platforms that were not originally designed for this purpose of task. These are general purpose social media and televideo conferencing platforms, which we are now converting to provide education. They are not giving you end-to-end management of school programs. And also, by design, most of these systems were not designed with security in mind. And therefore, there's the element of data breaches. And even for those that they have been designed with security in mind, they are not secure by default, because it requires you, for example, to enable encryption on the system. And because many organizations don't have proper onboarding procedures for some of these technologies, they actually do a default implementation. And therefore, the security feature that allows you to encrypt and protect data online may be available, but if you don't consciously as an organization enable it, it will not work. 2 days ago, I saw some information on social media circulating about some theft of personal data of students from some local colleges. And, basically these are people who have mined this information from some of these websites for criminal purposes. And so there is a real risk that apart from the service not being available or providing the full extent of the service that was expected, there is a breach to personal privacy. This information could include personal addresses, IDs, names, and residences of the learners, as well as access to the education of the school programs and school records for criminal purposes. If you look at again, the retail sector, and that's why I said we need to look to address this from sector-specific eyes. Everybody is now encouraging cashless transactions are being promoted. We know the use of money provides some level of anonymity, in the sense that if I come and buy a bottle of water from your shop and I pay you in cash, there is no trace left behind as to who actually gave you this specific money, and there may be no record or trace of who came and did purchase. Today, if you are doing any form of cashless transactions, there is a trace. You are using your credit card, of course it will be run, and the merchant will have to retain some details about the person that processed the card. If you are doing a money transfer, of course the person that you're transferring money to would get to have some personal details about you, including your mobile number as well as your full names. And these are details that we are placing out there, too many of them. Despite the convenience some of these modes deliver to us, there are really concerns about the protection of data that we are putting out there. In the healthcare sector, we're talking about most of the manufacturing plants today are relying on automated systems, what we call cyber-physical systems, to control the manufacture, distribution, and packaging of drugs. Now, and again, some of this, because they want to operate 24/7, include by default remote access tools. These remote access tools are used to monitor, manage the plant, and make sure that it operates 24/7. Now, as we know from 2015-16, Ukraine power cuts were caused by Russians who exploited some of these remote administration tools. And again, that can happen. In the recent past, I think we saw the cybersecurity agencies in the US and the UK issuing a joint advisory warning against increased probings of their networks, especially targeting research institutions and pharmaceutical industry to steal information relating to the potential research into the COVID-19 cure. The worst thing would be, what if somebody actually compromised these systems and they altered the formulation of a potential cure so that they increase maybe the, what I would call, for want of a better, term, the toxicity levels in terms of, you know, if you were to make a drug that must contain so much of this compound, then you're talking about somebody increasing the evolution, the formula, altering the formulation of the drug so that it becomes something else, which then would have a safety implication in terms of its customers.
Interesting.
Very. So maybe for me, yes, I would look at your question was the fears. And in my interactions with the board, I find them haunted by a number of fears, but maybe I can pick three that I find very prominent. One is the fear that the perpetrator could be inside, that you could be spending in bed with somebody who can jab you one night. And that haunts them, you know, because they don't understand what is this. That, for example, from a board member who is not as as proficient in ICT, keep on wondering what could be the gurus in IT doing. And they involve them in decision making, they involve them in the approval, but they don't know. Two is that the criminal out there may be more sophisticated than the rep of security. And so you sleep with this fear that would they attack us at night? And then three is the fact that ICT risk occurrence or cyber risk occurrence portends many other risks, like the reputation risk, the operational risk. You could lose your money and you could lose, your data. The personal risk involved, that the risk could happen in such a manner that you are a person of interest, and then of course the risk of business continuity, whether you could suffer extinction because of the occurrence of cyber risk.
Interesting, good point. You go ahead. All right, so yeah, it's good you mentioned the business continuity. I particularly am keen on the fear of business interruption. You know, that day when you wake up and you don't have your data, your database is wiped out, you can't do business, systems are shut down, there's a ransomware in there, lacking somewhere in your network, and you can't access whatever it is. I mean, you have customers coming in, but you can't serve them. Okay? That moment, I think is one of the things that I really think is a great fear for leaders. And now that we sort of understand, and you guys have clearly told us, you know, some of the things that leaders, board members sort of fear. And I know very soon Steve might be joining a board somewhere as well. Steve, sorry for blowing your cover. Yeah, so probably this is some of the fears that we'll be having, in the near future. So probably what, as a board member, let me start with you, Steve. I'm preparing you for that role to come. What what questions?
Go ahead.
What questions should board members and senior level management folks ask around managing risks as part of the overall enterprise or operational risk management effort?
I think my take would be, and I guess the question probably is going towards whoever is not whoever responsible, the IT team or the CISO. My key question would be, first, do we understand our risk appetite, our cyber risk appetite? And with that, I'm talking of, first, do we even have understanding of which are our assets? Where are our assets sitting? What defense controls have we put in to mitigate against cyber risk on those assets? Thirdly, and more importantly, if you are to be hit, what plan do we have to respond to contain the threat? And maybe lastly is, do we have other risk mitigation controls that we put in place? For example, have we considered taking up cyber insurance to cover up or rather to protect the business from the residual risk, despite putting other process and of course training our people and technology controls? Having a proper understanding of that will then probably be able to guide into the next conversations.
Dismas and Lesson, what do you think the board should really be concerned, and what should they be asking their team members, probably in preparation to and ensure that the board itself is proactive in terms of managing risk?
Good question. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
The starting point would be, if I was sitting in a board, the first thing I would want to know from management is who is responsible for the management of cybersecurity within the organization. Roles and responsibilities. What is their level of authority and accountability structures for this purpose, for this function? What budget has been allocated to cybersecurity management in the organization? I'll ask questions regarding what laws and regulations apply to our organization. What are the specific external laws and regulations as a corporate entity are we expected to comply with? How do we know if we have complied with those laws and regulations? How do we measure and report compliance? Again, you will need to look at how do we identify and manage risks within the organization, especially those cybersecurity related risks. How do we identify? How do we identify our assets in terms of where they are, in terms of the possible threats and the threat actors and sources? We're looking at what value do we assign to them? How do we protect them? How do we detect if there is a breach? How do we respond? How do we recover? And again, in the context of what is happening today in the world, a lot of organizations are trying to do everything to please their customers. The question is, how do they actually know if they are providing enough to meet the minimum and most critical needs of their customers? And two, how do they know if they are not already doing too much? Maybe some of the services they are trying to deliver in this kind of circumstances are possibly services that could be suspended. The question is, how do they identify which of their services are critical, which are not? And even for those that are critical, for how much longer can they actually continue operating in this mode? And do they have a budget? Do they have the infrastructure to support this kind of method of delivery of services to their customers? That would
Dismas, any thoughts?
be my contribution.
Sorry, Nelson.
That was this.
That was Dismas.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel the discussion is quite sufficient. But of course, maybe just as an add-on is that we have the risk management framework that starts with risk identification. And for me, I'll be very keen to find out how that framework is developed. And like Dismas has said, how do you do risk identification? And even looking at past risk, like an inventory of past occurrences and how they have been treated. how the kind of disruption that it caused. Basically saying, I would really want to see whether we can benefit, leverage from the past experiences and draw lessons for the future. Because one of the most embarrassing things is for you to keep on having the same bad experiences and maybe even applying the same kind of responses. You'd fall into what one said madness is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. So I'd want to see that identification. Which risk have we decided to contain within our organization, and which risk have we now agreed that these ones we need to transfer? And then, of course, I'll be keen on monitoring and evaluation. How often do we keep on evaluating the risk exposure and the kind of mitigations that we do? Plus, I would also be keen on reports. I liked what Dismas talked about corporate role modeling, but I'll also be keen to see whether we have benefited from risks that have occurred elsewhere and we have documented them, seeing what other people did and they were exposed to those risks, together with all what others have said.
Good last point there. You want to learn from, probably incidences and risk scenarios that have happened before. And so I think one of the key things, personally, if I'm in a board, I would want to ask is, give us real life scenarios or give us hypothetical scenarios of when we are hit, when you're hacked. What we do in the immediate, what do we do in the near term, what can we do? Those kind of questions. So having this sort of mental picture idea of what the risk scenarios are, I think that would be an interesting one. And of course, when the board asks questions, probably part of the reasons they want to understand is to know where to put resources, where to do budgeting, things like those. But the board itself also needs some of these resources and tools. Initially, I think Dismas and Nelson, you had mentioned about self-auditing of the board. The board should be able to audit themselves and see what are the resources in terms of talent, skills gaps, etc. But let me just ask this question straight up. What are the tools and the resources, or rather even information, do the corporate leaders need for them to effectively oversight risk management? And Steve, I'll direct this to you for starters. What do you think could be probably, let's say, the first 5 or the first 10, whatever it is you can give us, that these guys need on a day-to-day or month-to-month basis for them to manage risk? Steve? Well, Dismas, you can, or Nelson, you can maybe give a shot at it. Hello.
Yeah, maybe I would look at, there's a model that was, international ISO, that 1000, that created a risk management framework. And one of the things that I picked was the issue of documentation. And what has happened within your organization. And 2 is also what could have happened in other organizations. Document and look at various responses, the way you talked about simulation. And for me, another thing, because sometimes, you can't learn swimming from reading a book. I'll be very keen on simulations, simulating a real life scenario. What would happen if we lost our data? You simulate that. What would happen if we would had a total shutdown of our system? What would happen if we detect that somebody was hacking our system? Because some of these things, I doubt that you can read a book and get the responses, the right responses, only from reading a book. And so I would be very happy if I would know what would happen if I am thrown into the water by just being thrown, simulating in a pod before I go possibly to a bigger swimming pool or to the Lead Ocean.
Interesting. And in security, we always talk a lot about tabletop exercises for incident response, and of course other frameworks as well. So maybe Dismas, you can tell us more about that.
Yeah, when you talk about in terms of the tools that are available, and I will come back later to the issue that we talked about tabletop exercises. unless you are a giant in the industry with your own internal sets of and procedures that are aligned to industry best practices, if you were to implement a cybersecurity risk management framework within the organization, my best advice would be don't try to reinvent the wheel unless you have a limitless amount of resources. There are frameworks that are publicly available, and I would specifically here talk about, for example, Octave is a risk management framework, which is described as original from the College Melon University, described as a self-directed risk management framework, which identifies potential threats, the threat sources, the motives of those threats, and what, in terms of whether it is accidental or malicious, and what they can do to an organization asset or an organization's asset that is at risk.
Dismas?
Can adopt that. The other one, again, this is not industry specific. It can be adopted very quickly to an organization specifically, is the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is the National Institute of Standards of Technology, which is basically an American developed basically for federal agencies in the US, but that we are seeing increasingly being adopted by private sector within and even beyond the US. And these sort of frameworks, the advantage they deliver to you is that first and foremost, they are available for free. And secondly, they have adequate amount of documentation that can allow an organization to actually implement them without the requirement of having external training or a high level of expertise of the people that are responsible. They already incorporate a lot of international global standards, and therefore you don't have to start searching through so many different standards. The moment you know you have adopted one of these, and these are just two examples, you know you have more than actually addressed most of the issues. Then when it comes to the issue of that you talked about business continuity, of course, there are also specific standards like with the ISO 22301, which is an ISO standard for business continuity based on the plan, do, check, act sort of approach. And one of the things that you need to start by is trying to understand the organization, setting the organizational context where you set your policies, you set the tone at the top, you assign roles and responsibilities. And then, of course, the next thing would be implementing, developing your specific plans, which is basically through a process of risk assessment, business impact assessment, to identify specific activities or services that must be provided, and also assessing the impact of non-availability of those services to your key customers, as well as failure to meet regulatory requirements, be it for purposes of reporting. And then, of course, there's the element of implementing the plan also entails rehearsing the plans. And a lot of people, unfortunately, what I see from industry, and this is one of my areas of expertise, is that most organizations tend to do this for the purpose of passing an audit. So they do a single document, which they call a business continuity, rather than looking at specific plans that address specific functions within the organization. And even in terms of the testing, the best practice requires that, for example, you start your testing and you carry it out in a very progressive way. And at every stage, you are increasing the level of coverage as well as the complexity. So you might today start from a desktop walkthrough, which is basically reviewing your plan. Have you documented all the procedures? You give it to somebody independent of the person that designed the plan. Go through the plan. Tell me, by reading this, what do you understand? What do you think you would do if I gave you this plan? And I'm assuming I will not be there. Is it sufficient to guide you through the process? The second thing is that you start picking specific elements of that plan and you test them in real life without necessarily stopping the primary operations. And once you do single element plan testing, then you you move to the next level, which will be a combination of elements of the plan, until such a time that you have developed as an organization sufficient confidence levels that would allow you to do a simultaneous, in other words, you test all elements of your plan without, first and foremost, stopping the primary services. And once you are comfortable that it's working, then you can actually now do a full interruption plan testing. Now, in doing this, one of the challenges that I also see is that when organizations are testing this, they actually don't test the cybersecurity requirements. For example, how do people access the site physically? How do they access the systems logically? User IDs, passwords, you know, how do your customers contact you at the alternate site if you have moved away from your primary site? And so these are all things that you need to do. And to even make it better, you can actually invite independent observers and auditors to actually assess and report on your performance of this function. Most importantly, is a question of what lessons have you learned from carrying out this kind of an exercise. The success of a business continuity plan is not in terms of the absence of issues that emerged, but in terms of what gaps and issues did you actually identify in your plans, which you need to work on to make your plan even better. That is the key distinction, and therefore it is important that people understand. And when you go to this kind of plans, you must set out proper documentation which defines the objectives, the scope of what you are going to plan to test. How will you distinguish between failure and success of your plans? And all this must be agreed a priori before you actually embark on this kind of exercise. Otherwise, then it becomes a subjective assessment. One person, depending on which side they are standing, would be saying it's a failure. Another person would be saying it is a success. I want to be able to say one of the elements we are testing is to ensure that everybody knows where our recovery facilities are there. How many people out of the 100 that were supposed to go there actually made it? If it is 98%, we say it's 98%. If you didn't have that element in your test plan script, it will become a subjective element. Then, in terms of logical access, you would be saying, we intended to bring up 10 out of the 10 systems that we provide as an organization up at the alternate site. Were they 10 up or were they not up? Now, if the 10 of them were up, if it's 100%, again, there's no debate about that. How many of the 20 or the 50% of the users that we wanted to actually successfully access these systems and run 1 or 2 tests were able to do so? If you don't document all this, your whole exercise is just reduced to a subjective and a meaningless exercise that serves no purpose. Thank you.
Just to add on to the same, again, I've also noticed a big challenge in the market where people assume that a business continuity plan is the same thing as a cyber incident response plan. The two are totally different, and the scope, the objectives of two are very different. Now, a lot of tabletop exercise, as you say, CEFAs, do of course help organizations to prepare for that eventuality. But it's until you're immersed into a cyber incident and the board and the management of the organization has to make fast decisions and on the go, that's a real test for how prepared you are. Now, instead of the organization having to wait until the point where they actually compromise or they actually hit and they have to start practicing what they put in the incident response plan, there are simulations that have been put in place that one enable that the organization to test that cyber incident response plan. And also, and this is the most important, the communication, because it's a matter of time. What decisions are you making and how fast are you able to make that decision with the rest of the board or the senior management of the organization to contain the situation, while at the same time being able to provide services to your customers, for example, being also able to engage with the regulator, being able to engage with the law enforcement if need be, and most importantly, how do you manage your the public? What kind of communication are you sending out? So there are cyber crisis simulation, what more of like a game that puts senior management into a room simulate a cyber attack. And at the same time, we are testing whether they are following, what's documented on the response plan. But more importantly is how well are you able to communicate with the internal stakeholders as well as external stakeholders, while at the same time still trying to do business.
Interesting you've mentioned about communication, and probably I'll speak something. This is just my own thoughts. But clearly, there's evidently the need for a lot of exercises, a lot of abiding by the standards, making sure a lot of documentation, including reporting, and of course simulation. Testing things out in the real scenarios. So coming back to communication, I know there are three very important aspects of corporate governance in general, and I know one. Maybe I can mention them. One of them, of course, responsibility, which we talked about a lot. Accountability, again, we've talked about a lot. People being able to be held accountable. But the other one is transparency, and I think this is where communication really comes in. In a typical sense, when the IT team or the cybersecurity team goes to the board, for instance, the CISO, they'll need to be able to be very transparent and communicate if they're going to sell what they have, so that they ensure that the board can respond by giving resources and putting in the right processes and things like that. So that element of being transparent, to give the board exactly what it is, as Dismas was saying, if it is 98, it is 98. That transparency is important so that the board understands the real sense of what the IT or the cybersecurity team is talking about. And in a crisis situation, definitely transparent communication is key, because you want the right decisions to be made based on the right data or the right information. So let me jump quickly into the chat section, and I'll just go through a few questions and have you guys respond in a minute or two so that we can wrap up in the next few minutes. Someone is asking that in addition, okay, let me truncate the question. So how do we get the board to be more proactive than reactive with regards to this? I'm not sure, I'm saying with regards to the same. Most times some don't know the devastating effect of a cyber breach. Probably what he's asking is that how do we get the board to be more proactive and to actually invest in cybersecurity proactively? Any thoughts, Steve? Dismas or Nelson?
Yeah, maybe I can go first, then Dismas can.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. Yes, go ahead.
I go ahead?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember the words of Peter Drucker, who says that organization culture, it's strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. One way, like I said, culture is like an iceberg. One way to measure a culture of an organization is look at the response time. How long does it take for an organization to respond to a need, to an urgency? In some organizations, taking time in decisiveness, taking no decision is a culture. And so if you want to transform the rate at which the board makes decisions, you must go to the core. Relook at the organization culture, create urgency. And this is change management. And so go through the whole process of change management, because you want people to change from this like Russia approach to serious issue to more aggressive, being more proactive. And then two is be preemptive in nature. Before a risk has happened, try as much as possible to put measures, have a policy that gives this is how we respond to it. So that it does not depend on the whims, it does not depend on how the board is feeling. Put in place those measures. It is like pressing the bell. So you do not go buying a fire extinguisher, for example, when fire comes. Have the fire extinguisher in place and keep on testing that it is in the right working status. It is change management.
Interesting. This was?
Yeah, in my view, in terms of ensuring that boards are proactive in terms of managing cyber-related risks, there are a lot of statistics globally in terms of organizations that have survived, as well as those that have not survived major incidents like the pandemic that we are witnessing. If you look at the 2001 World Trade Center twin bombings, there are statistics that indicate that there are those organizations that were able to be back in business within weeks. There are also those organizations that actually did not survive that major incident. And so you can use some of these statistics to demonstrate to your boards why it is necessary for you to plan in advance so that you can actually minimize the level of confusion that is likely to happen in terms of responding to a major incident. Now, that is one. And secondly, it goes back to the way boards are selected, how they are constituted, and how they are balanced. If you don't have somebody at board level that speaks this language, that has an appreciation of some of these issues, it becomes very, very difficult for you as a manager or somebody who's been assigned the responsibility for managing the program within the organization to convince the board. And that is why most boards have got to have at least, depending on the industry they are in, the requirement for independent directors who speak, who say things as they are, rather than coloring them to please certain powers that be. In the extreme case, that does not happen. And I am not sure if I should say this, but let me say it. If it requires me, as somebody responsible for the program in the organization, to talk to us external auditors to push this agenda for me, I will not hesitate to do so, because in so doing, I am likely to achieve the results without necessarily being.
Hello, Dismas. Hello. Yeah, looks like we've lost him there. Steve, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. In fact, I was just thinking of something I wanted to add on to what Dismas was saying. And this is in regards to, I think when earlier on we started the conversation.
Who speaks?
Oh, he's back.
Oh, yes,
Dismas?
Yes, I'm back. Sorry, yeah, that was
a minute before.
correction.
All right, please proceed.
Yeah, I was saying in brief, I was saying there are statistics that are bound everywhere in terms of how organizations have survived and how organizations have failed to overcome crisis or to get back to business because of major crisis. So you can use those statistics to sell the idea to your board. But more importantly, I talked about the balancing of the board in terms of the specific skill sets and the inclusion of independent directors who are an independent voice that will say things as they are to their shareholders in terms of making sure that this program is carried out effectively and on a timely manner. Finally, and because I really need to leave now, is the issue I say that if the board is not properly balanced, and they're not listening to your ideas or the senior management's idea of managing risks, speak to your external auditors to drive the agenda for you. If these issues are raised at audit level, well, most likely is boards will start listening. And in so doing, you're not being unfaithful to the board. You are actually assisting them. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dismas. I know you have to leave, but thank you so much for the insights. Steve and Nelson, I think you're wrapping up in the next few. Probably just let me say one interesting question here. So someone is asking the cybersecurity team, to whom is it supposed to report to?
That's a very political question. I think there are always different approaches to answer that question. It's based on there are industries that are regulated. So like, for example, in Kenya, the financials, the CISO reports directly now to the board. But now coming to other organizations, I think you need to ensure that the CISO is reporting to a position where they'll have influence, where they are not curtailed in terms of their resources, and they're able to report to a position where the cybersecurity agenda is given the seriousness it deserves. So I guess those are the same reasons why maybe CBK opted for CISO to report directly to the board, unlike go through a CISO or a risk manager or any other intermediary managers within the organization. But however, that may not always work for some organizations. So if you think of a very lean organization, that approach may not probably be applicable to that organization. Doesn't mean that they are wrong, but there are challenges if cybersecurity is reporting to some positions. So I guess it will work with the industry, with the structure of the organization in terms of how big is the IT structure or the security structure. So there are quite a number of elements that would advise to that answer. I don't think there's one straight, answer to that.
Yeah, very true. I want us to do a bit of a trivia, Steve and Nelson, quickly.
Yes.
In terms of risk responsibility, should the management bear the responsibility or the board, or both? Nelson?
Yeah, now again, if you look at the risk management policies for many organizations, and this is now what I'll put it, is that there is the responsibility that is borne by the board, there is the responsibility that is cascaded down to the senior management and all down. And even when the board is not involved at the operational level, you find them carrying what we call the fiduciary responsibility. And that is why an occurrence at the operational level may cause the board to be removed. And so the buck must stop. And so it is unfortunate that sometimes it stops with the board, even when they are not directly involved at the operational level, because they have a duty, one, to put policies, and then of course to ensure that they monitor properly.
Very true, Nelson. Just to add on a few sentiments on the same. So yes, the board, of course, they take ownership and accountability for the risk management. But the management also come in for two perspectives. One, implementation of the strategy that has been put forth by the board, rather. And secondly, reporting back to the board in terms of what are we doing within the organization to contain the risk.
Okay, interesting. So the CISO or the CIO, should they have, or should one of them have a permanent seat at the board?
Again, another political question. Another political question from this perspective. I guess I'll still answer the same way. If there's a position to have the CISO sitting on the board, well and good. Again, depending on the size of the organization, they may have the CIO sitting on the board, or either both of them don't even sit there. They report through a finance director or a finance manager. So it's based on the organization. But again, also, you don't want to have two individuals who will have conflicting interests. The CIO will be probably focusing more in terms of what kind of, IT resources or IT advancements that we can bring into the business. The CISO on the other side is looking at it from a cyber risk perspective, and in most cases, he'll be trying to argue out that before maybe we push a certain technology, maybe we need to address XYZ, which would affect also the time to get to the market. So you see, if the two are sitting there, probably there are some conflicts.
Well, I think that brings out the political side of it. Yeah.
Maybe
so,
for me to add is that.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to say, depending with if you want to see how an organization values a responsibility, look at the structure, look at the reporting lines. So as a responsibility continues to gain prominence, you see it getting very close to where decisions are being made. And therefore, I also want to suggest that we also have a responsibility to keep on highlighting the significance of our responsibilities. Then, of course, you mentioned the word transparency, which sometimes appear to be very theoretical, but also for the board, when they want to get the real value for information, there's no harm, even if the reporting lines indicate that the reporting structure is different. The board has latitude to invite anybody they think has information they may use.
Interesting. Executive powers, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's. Someone knows how to use it somewhere. So in terms of breach disclosure, disclosure, which I think is also huge part of transparency. Is it good or bad for business? Like, let's look at it from a realistic perspective. What companies are going through, what companies are doing. Is it good or is it bad for business? When you disclose breaches, Steve.
I think for at least in Kenya and majority of East African countries, we don't have regulations that require companies to disclose. Of course, to regulators, there are few industries that do so. But for me, I look at it from two perspectives. One, by you disclosing what happened, is also an opportunity for other industry players to learn. Earlier on, we spoke about benchmarking. So why would an organization in the financial sector probably undergo through a cyber incident, and yet the other players in the same industry will undergo through the same thing probably in the next 2-3 months? We could have learned a lot from that one single incident and protect the entire industry and the economy. Secondly, also, in terms of the customers, we have a right also to be informed if our data is exposed, if also our finances are also being depleted, for example, in our bank account. For us also to be, one, aware, and secondly, for us to know what mitigating control to take. For example, if today I know some provider where I have an account, probably they have my personal info, or rather where they are processing my personal info and they have been breached, I have a right to know that that has happened so that I can take mitigating controls to prevent my account being abused, for example.
All right. Any final thoughts, Nelson?
Yeah. Now, if you look at how we started reporting Corona, you understand the power of what we would consider to be stigma as far as managed disclosure of information is concerned. So the more we destigmatize, if there is a word like that, these breaches, the more we are likely to find more people coming up, and the more we are likely to benefit from their experiences. But two, is also looking at the reputation risk. So you must moderate to see whether this is a disclosure that is likely to cause more business harm than good.
Absolutely. Now, with that, we have come to the end of this wonderful, very insightful, very rich, very comprehensive conversation. And I want to thank a lot our speakers for coming through. But before I put out my parting shot, you can see on your screen there's a flyer there and it's written QuarterCon. I just want to put this out there using this platform. Forgive me, Steve. Yeah, but so we hope to, sorry, not we hope. And so as Cyber in Africa, we are hosting a conference called QuarterCon, and it will be on the 3rd of July. And the theme, as you can see on the screen, is taking action now. This is a conference. This is a one-day conference that will be focusing on the senior level professionals within cybersecurity, IT, and generally the business. And the goal of this conference will be to empower and enable senior leaders, senior management guys, with tools and resources and knowledge for them to take action now in terms of inspiring change within the cybersecurity programs in the organization. So this is an invite for all of you who are listening and seeing the screen. Check out the website. Please go ahead and register for the conference. We are yet to announce formally, so this is a sneak peek I am giving you guys because I love you so much, and you've been very nice and you've listened into this conversation. So go to the website, check out, register. We'd love to host you. And would love to hear your thoughts as well on social media. You can follow all the links that I've shared in the chat section as well. Let's connect and let's see what we can do together. So finally, thank you so much again to the speakers. Dismas left, but thanks to him in absentia. Thank you, Nelson. You've been very
Thank you.
rich, and you definitely prepared for this. I know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, for putting this together. I think the topic
Thank
is
you.
wonderful. The topic is wonderful, and we definitely should have a rerun of this sometime. Hopefully, we can even move this conversation into the conference that I've just talked about, and see
Okay.
how we can expand it as well. Thanks to the audience for sticking around through the last 1 hour and more. So my apologies. Normally webinars are 1 hour, but because of the richness and the expansiveness of the conversation, we try to allow the speakers, to share as much as they can, so that we all can learn as much as we can. Right. So having said all that, from my end, I think I thank myself again, as always, for hosting, being given this opportunity. If you have a webinar out there or an event out there that you're running, I'm always available to host. I love talking to people. I love getting people ideas. And I hope even the questions that you've shared today, they've been enabled you guys to learn a lot and gain a lot of perspectives. So thank you so much. And I'd like to invite Lisa to close for us.
Thanks, Cephas. Before Lisa comes in, I know there are some questions we've not been positioned to answer that I'm seeing on chat. I would advise, or rather, I would respond to them individually and probably do like a small MailChimp just for the questions that were not addressed, just to ensure that all of us at least get some feedback on some of those questions. Apologies, I think time was not on our side. Lisa, over to you.
Thank you, Steve, Nelson, and Cephas. This has really been an interactive session. Hopefully, we'll get to do this again. For those who are new, we always have these webinars every Friday, starting from 11 a.m., of course, West African time. So feel free to join in. If you have any questions, always get in touch with us. You can get us on all social media platforms at Yale Bridges. So feel free to interact with us, consult us, and we'll be available to assist you in any way possible. So thank you again, and have a great weekend.
All right. Have a great weekend, Lisa, Nelson, Steve, and everyone
Thank
else.
you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.